Well, good afternoon from cloudy Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and thank you so much for joining us for another great keynote. With advancements in technology over the past several decades, we are now more connected than ever. We can have face-to-face conversations with someone across the globe in an instant. With the click of a button, the power company can turn on our electricity or stop gas from coming. All this interconnectivity brings great advantages and major pitfalls. Our digital ecosystem is under constant attack by bad actors looking to exploit hardware and software vulnerabilities and penetrate system defenses. For context, just look at the Colonial Pipeline incident that led to a regional gas line shortage and costly price hikes. Exactly 2 months ago, on March 1st, the White House released a national cybersecurity strategy. The aim is to help organizations promote and implement robust measures designed to defend critical systems against attacks from adversaries in the new cyber age. Today's guests will help us understand some key takeaways from that strategy. Before I bring him on, a couple of housekeeping things. We want our conversation to be as interactive as possible. So go ahead and submit your questions in the chat dialog box. You can do so by clicking the top right corner of the player. We'll also be asking you a series of poll questions to help us kind of tailor our conversation via this QR code on the screen. You can submit your responses by scanning it with your phone. You can also go to slido.com and enter the code K050123 to submit your responses. So to our first question to the audience, what level of experience do you have when it comes to cybersecurity? Now, as we wait for your responses, we will be sharing some helpful resources as well, so kind of keep a lookout for those. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome back our returning champion, Len Kennedy, an adjunct professor at the law school here at Cornell. He has more than 35 years of experience advising organizations on telecommunication and media law, regulatory strategy, and investment matters affecting wireless, wired, and internet services and networks. Len was instrumental in the merger of Sprint and Nextel. He also happens to be the faculty author of our Data Security and Privacy Policy Certificate program. Len, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
And we're slowly starting to get in some responses from our audience, and it looks like some folks have a minimal experience regarding some cybersecurity. So we're hoping that today's conversation kind of help them out a little bit. And Len, do you find that most people have some type of experience with some cybersecurity, or they have kind of no experience with cybersecurity?
So, Nick, I think the responses you're getting from the audience are somewhat typical. Mm-hmm. There are all kinds of people who have varying depths of understanding about the field and some of the problems. As in every field, there are those mavens who go deep and wide. Then there are others who come across security and related issues, say perhaps through their work. If you work in an industry that's very important to the economy, financial services or utility work, these people tend to have a greater occupational background and insight, and that tends to play over into their private lives as well. I think one of the things, the aims ultimately of the National Cyber Strategy is to get the whole population up the learning curve. Everyone doesn't have to be a super expert, but they have to know enough to protect themselves.
And I'd be interested to know how you define someone's level of experience with cybersecurity as minimal. Is it maybe they know about two-step authentication? How would you define kind of a minimal level of experience with cybersecurity?
Well, it's a good question. Let's maybe think about what's minimally acceptable. So are you using passwords on your devices? The way to think about it, Samuel Jackson, what's in your wallet? What's in your PC? What's in your smartphone? You want to protect it, you have to take some measures. I think experience shows that many consumers in particular may have relatively weak passwords or only one password. They're not using two-factor authentication, which is a more secure form of protection for your devices, which companies like Google and Apple and others are increasingly rolling out because we've found that with weak passwords, systems are easier to hack. Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned it a little bit in my introduction, but give us a little background. When was the very first national cybersecurity policy released?
Well, to frame it, going back to the Obama administration, they didn't have a, quote, national cyber policy per se, but they did adopt a 600-page report looking at all aspects of the cyber challenges faced by the country. And even in the Bush administration, measures were taken, and actually the alarm was raised by the National Director of National Intelligence with respect to some of the vulnerabilities that we face. Major hacks, very concerning hacks, started to happen in mid, 2008, 9, and 10, and we've seen that continue on. So, it's a continuous march, and we learn through experience. But so, and in the Trump administration had a national cyber strategy. And ultimately, by the way, it was Congress that made the decision that it would be important to help the whole government focus on these issues, to make that a charge of the White House. And in fact, now there's a 75-person office inside the White House focused on cybersecurity. There's a director of national cybersecurity, and that person is at the level of deputy level of national security, as in foreign policy and defense of the United States. So it's a very, very important role, and it's a coordinating agency for the entire U.S. government and the nation as a whole.
And we have a copy of this year's cybersecurity policy, so we can kind of pull that up for the audience. And you touched on this a little bit, but I'd be interested to know what makes this year's policy different from ones that were in the past.
Well, it's a very good question. I think principally it's only 35 pages, but what it covers is really quite remarkable. It's very broad. It conceives our, digital challenges and opportunities in a very broad sense, looking at how we're now doing with respect to our own security. Of course, there's a heightened threat environment, which commenced with the initiation of the war in Ukraine. And shortly thereafter, or about that time, Homeland Security put in what they called a shields up policy, which meant that on a day-by-day basis since February of a year ago, U.S. companies and computer and data system users have been advised of all known exploits and vulnerabilities that have been detected, which allows anyone employing those systems, computers, hardware, software, whatever, to identify their vulnerabilities, repair, remediate, and get good from a security point of view. So, and in this sort of regular cadence every day, we now, I think, are having more and more people who are not in the most vulnerable sectors of the economy, but other parts of the economy, recognizing that it's a 24/7 exercise. Just as we're on the global web or our systems 24/7, so are the malign forces out there. They're all the time probing for vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. So, that's the mindset we have to have about this. It's not one that we have to be paranoid about. We just have to be prepared for, understand what our risks are, educate ourselves. And I think increasingly companies that serve the public, whether it's on cell phones or other devices and services, are doing more to educate. Banks are certainly doing more. I know my bank says we will not reach out to you by text. If it's a text supposedly from us, it's not from us. And other services are doing that to help their customers better figure out how to navigate in the world we're living in now. Excuse me.
And you were talking a little bit about vulnerability just a second ago, and I remember kind of watching a video with, I believe it was Senator Rob Portman on the floor talking about the need for a government to have this type of policy. And I specifically remember him mentioning government doesn't have the tools to fight against these virtual attacks like solar, wind, or the Colonial Pipeline. And I'd be interested to know, what do you think is the first tool the government should look into as far as, protecting the country from these cyber attacks?
Well, Senator Portman is right. And fundamentally what he was saying is most of the computer systems in the country are not in the hands of the government. They're in the hands of private organizations, colleges, universities, businesses, all sorts of enterprises. And those owners have some duties with respect to keeping their systems secure. And in some instances, it's not their fault that their systems aren't secure. Hardware and software can have flaws in them, and it's up to the manufacturers of those devices to take care of those flaws. Although once they're in the hands of the user, that creates a potential communications gap where things that are flawed don't get fixed. And that's part of what Homeland Security is addressing now that I mentioned earlier. The government, by the way, has also taken a major effort to fix its own systems. And this has been going back 2 administrations at least. And the Biden administration's been very robust in going to 2-factor authentication, more secure systems, and greater focus on these issues. And in part, they're doing that to improve the security of their systems, but also to incentivize good practices, the adoption of good practices by business and private users. So to the extent the government raises the standard or level of security, government contractors in many instances will have to do that. And non-government contractors will say, gee, the market's showing us that there's a higher standard of security that can be implemented. We ought to go there. Now, these are the kinds of problems that cannot be adapted by snapping your fingers because it takes time. There's a contracting process. There's an assessment of where you are with your own company team. And as well, if you're in certain industries, you're participating in what we call the joint private-public partnership. There's certain coordinating committees, councils, and groups that are meeting, identifying specific problems in certain sectors and industries. So there's a tremendous amount of work going on. And although for the public, this 35-page document seems new, there have been many, many people, thousands of people inside the country working on various aspects of this problem.
And I'd be interested to know, do you see that kind of becoming a waterfall effect? Obviously, government at a national level is understanding that they need more security. And then do you think that'll kind of transition into, state, local governments, and then ultimately into the private sector? Do you see that kind of waterfall effect happening?
Nick, I do see that happening. And in truth, going back to the 2016 election, there's a lot of concern about the integrity of the election system in the country. Homeland Security worked very, very closely with state and local governments to administer our elections. And, fortunately, I think our level of security there is really quite high. And I think that has a spillover effect. And as the more we see ransomware attacks and other things on the front pages of the newspaper, this topic is becoming increasingly top of mind. I do expect that the new national cybersecurity policy will have a similar effect in society. And it's certainly the case, that corporate boards and other leaders inside their organizations have this as one of their top 5 concerns about how do we remain, viable in the business? How do we recover from an attack? Most companies, large companies for sure, have, sustainability programs in place. So, there are tools. And if you can recover quickly, then you get resilience and you can get back online.
Mm-hmm. And I know the White House releases the policy, obviously, but is there a specific department that coordinates drafting the policy? I know you had mentioned now there's a group of about 75 folks, but is there a specific department that's maybe working behind the scenes to kind of craft this policy?
Sure. There are many government agencies that have a role. And historically, the way we've done it in the U.S., certain regulated industries, for example, have like the Federal Reserve Bank or other banking financial institutions. The Securities and Exchange Commission is now adopting cybersecurity related policies as well. So because of the complexities of certain industries, it doesn't really make sense to say there's one flavor of security, although there are some things that are general, but agencies with particular authority, the Federal Communications Commission, for example, looks with respect to communications services. The EPA deals with water protection systems. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure in the country, and in many instances, there is an appropriate regulator. Some industries are subject to less, say, government oversight from this point of view, but I do think the path we're on is going to take us to one where cyber will be top of mind, and we'll be getting advisories, warnings, and the like from various parts of the government. And sometimes it might be the government, sometimes it might be industry councils. So, the software industry, they look at problems associated with software. There's some particular concerns there that need to be addressed, and they will be in their sort of, let's say, a channel, if you will, and then it'll be inputted into the process where people in Washington might come together and assess it or make some determinations with respect to it.
And you actually stole my next question there. Was we actually have a really, really helpful slide to show folks kind of the different departments and everything like that. And my question is there specific departments, say, that do cybersecurity well or some that don't do as well? For instance, does the FCC, which regulates communication, do they do cybersecurity well versus, say, the Federal Reserve, who's over the bank? Is there specific departments that do this idea of cybersecurity well?
I won't give the agencies marks right now, but I will say this. The industries and agencies that have been most attacked are the ones in which you find the expertise the greatest. And it's, if we think about it, it's not surprising. If you've had problems in the past, that helps you get a personal insight and focus on it. And because banks have, of course, the money, they're extraordinarily valuable. They're essential to the economy. So they probably are spending almost the most of any industry, or right up in the top few categories. A couple of years ago, Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, said that they spend $600 million a year. That was a couple of years ago, so it's probably north of that now. And, but they're a very large enterprise, and with lots of employees, lots of physical locations, all of which have to be protected. And when services are provided in a soft or online manner, that presence is even greater than your physical presence. And all those systems have to work together, potentially being touched by different people. And in the realm of online life, if an accident happens, a power outage happens, then your system gets tested. So all those things have to be thought about, planned for, and kept running. Some agencies, and banking, for example, is highly connected, right? Mm-hmm. And not just domestically, but globally. So that greater global presence is potentially greater vulnerability. But if you're a local water system, in a rural town, you've got a water system, potentially you could be hacked if you're connected to communications networks. So there's a need for protection there as well. But the extent of the need is obviously quite different because of the nature of how they do business.
And we have a bunch of different departments and organizations listed on this graphic. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on one question that I just thought about was, do different departments and different organizations have different ideas or need different types of security? So I'm thinking of, say, does the Department of Defense, for example, need a different level of cybersecurity versus, say, the EPA or the Federal Reserve or the FCC? Does the policy talk about this at all?
The policy doesn't, because it's in one sense it's too high level. But there's been a lot of work in the last 5 years or more underneath the policy, and the policy is assuming that we're going to go forward with the things that are working well. We're going to keep improving the things that need to be improved, and that's been ongoing. And in particular, I mentioned earlier that through executive order, President Biden has asked government contractors and certain other parties to raise the bar, to go to two-factor authentication, to go to what's called zero trust, which is a more sophisticated technology-based way of protecting your networks and trying to both detect intruders sooner and to take them down, take them out of the systems. And so I would say the level of intensity and focus is increasing, and as it increases, companies are learning that they need to do more. And you point out, you raise a question about the Department of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously we have in the country manufacturers, our defense industrial base. They manufacture the weapons for our military. And not surprisingly, even those systems have been attacked over the years through cyber attacks. And the Secretary of the Navy in 2019 commissioned a study to look at the attacks that the Navy had experienced and asked for a top to bottom, soup to nuts cyber readiness review. It's an extraordinary document. It's quite good. It's unbelievably thorough. They engage parties outside of the Department of Defense, experts from Silicon Valley, Google and others, financial institutions, tech companies, others who had their own problems with being hacked. So the way to think about it is there's no one who's not been hacked. And there's no one who's not going to be attacked. And the question is, if you're online, be ready, be prepared, and use best practices. And the most important thing, take away in a certain way from the report that the Secretary of the Navy requested was the expert said the most important thing is to understand your business, your activities, what you're doing, and then to adopt governance policies, overall policies for the employees, how you do your business, and to really help people understand that not following protocols in the manuals or in other guidance upon reading laptops and how to handle flash drives and all these things that we just take for granted. We really have to have a different mindset and point of view that says, what could go wrong if what I have is compromised? If your equipment is compromised and you plug into a network, then your device, our devices can become a source of infection for the rest of the network. And so we all have a role to play in this. And even if we're not working in a company where that's the case, you never see anyone in the public library leave their wallet on the table and walk away. You do see them sometimes leave their backpacks, and you do see them sometimes leave their PCs. And I think we just have to ask ourselves now, if what's in your wallet, you want to protect it, take some action.
I actually love that commercial. I love the Samuel Jackson references. Love it. Anytime I can get him in a keynote, that's perfect. So I'd be interested to know, who would you say is most influential in bringing cybersecurity to the forefront and making sure this is kind of top of mind? Was it the Secretary of the Navy, or is there one person that's been most influential, I guess, in developing this cybersecurity strategy?
Well, in the United States, I think the most, they haven't been the loudest voices, but they've been very, very insistent and over a period of time. It's been partly out of, you could say, either the military or, the Director of National Intelligence. They have a job assigned to them by Congress, among other things. These are the intelligence agencies inside the country of preparing an annual report describing the problems associated with intelligence and the threats to the United States. And cyber has been on that list for a good 10 years now as a major threat. And I think in light of that, and of course, they know the most about what's going on in cyber. Cyber is unusual in a certain way, is that often what goes on in business outside the Beltway is clear to the people in business, but maybe not so clear to people in Washington. Cyber is one of those rare instances where I believe there's more information and knowledge inside Washington than there is outside the country. And part of the challenge is to get this view and understanding of the vulnerability known inside Washington into the hands and of decision makers throughout the country.
And you touched on a little bit of the businesses and the Beltway and everything like that. And this actually brings us to our second audience question. So again, scan the QR code with your phone. We have a poll question. The first question was kind of, what's your level of involvement with cybersecurity? So our next question that we want to ask you is, what has your organization done to protect their digital information? So kind of looking back, if you've gotten emails or anything like that, again, what has your organization done to protect their digital information? And As we wait for some of your responses from our audience, I'd like to ask you, Len, what are some things that you've seen that organizations have done as far as making sure that their information on the web or, in their systems is protected?
Well, we talked earlier about agencies that have a responsibility for a number of years now, the Federal Trade Commission, and they have a very good website, by the way. There's where you can even find consumer-friendly information, not solely, for the people who do cyber 24/7, but they address cybersecurity, they address the privacy of information, systems and policies, and they hold companies accountable for living up to what their cyber policies and practices are. And when those companies have suffered breaches or whatever, there's frequently litigation either in courts or before the regulatory agencies. And the FTC, relative to many other agencies, is very, consumer focused. So that gets down to the level of normal people. But I mentioned earlier, the Securities and Exchange Commission is looking at the appropriate set of requirements for large and important companies in our country to disclose their cyber incidents. And that's something the SEC believes investors would want to know. To the extent, your network is vulnerable, that may mean your business is vulnerable. So, we're increasingly getting more granular and coming from a variety of different directions. Many large companies, of course, have, more people, more resources. So they might have a team of, privacy executives who work that issue. There are almost certainly people in the IT department and other departments. And even you find in most companies that there's a little bit of a group activity because HR is collecting sensitive information from people. So the company has a legal obligation to protect that information and to not treat it casually or as though it weren't important. So we've got a lot of privacy laws on the books in the country, including at the state level. There's been a lot of criticism and concern that we've not been as forward-looking as we need to be with respect to protecting consumers' private information, of course, because when we're online, others can get a certain amount of information about our activities, and how much they can obtain is a function of what the settings are on our PCs or our devices. And, this is something I encourage all our listeners to kind of think about. What are the settings on the device? I mean, every device will come basically so that with a certain set of defaults so that you can connect and go online and do what you want to do. Increasingly, I find myself looking at, some of the settings, going to other sources of information about what are more robust, more protective settings. There are government agencies in the U.S., the Department of Homeland Security, among them, and the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards in the United States, that provide information to the public. Now, I'll confess, it's not always the easiest information to use, but things are starting to be provided that are simple and that we can act on. And almost every week, you'll see major ads from the Googles of the world or Apple or other companies talking to us, about what features and functions they offer that are security related. This wasn't really happening 2 years ago. It's happening now because we all have become more aware of the danger and risks of being casual and how we handle matters online. And so we need some re-education. And in one sense, it'll be education that'll be continuous because things change.
And it looks like the two biggest responses that we're getting are both MFA and training as far as kind of what organizations have done to protect their digital information. So I'm wondering, Len, if you could speak to, as far as the training aspect, what are some different training techniques that maybe organizations can implement to make sure that their employees know, hey, this is the best way to protect our cyber information?
MFA is multi-factor authentication. It's a way of having, let's say, two means of established your identity as the owner or the user of the equipment or service you're trying to use. Companies vary, and there's no set requirement that they have to face. But I think you find in most companies, not just large ones, even small ones, there is some form of an information technology policy or some set of practices that we're exposed to when we become an employee. We get devices from the company. Many companies, you have to take a compliance-related test to demonstrate that you paid attention to the policies. And I know this is one of the challenges that many people have, because you have to read the manual, go through the workshop online to comply, but yet at the same time, your boss is actually asking you for the work that you got when you showed up at work. And, so that's a balancing act. But I think we just can't overlook the importance of training. That's one form of training. I think, there's some things we should all be thinking about. How can we use informally, if you will? So, for example, you're in IT, or you get your product from IT or someone in HR, whoever that person is. It doesn't take too much to say, okay, well, I'm going to follow the policy, but what do you do? What do you use? What tricks have you learned? Not to get around the system, but how to be better protected. And the reason it's important to ask that kind of question is different industries are maybe attacked in different ways. So you'll be learning what people in the company have experienced, and that'll be a heads up for you.
Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned in my intro, the security policy has been out for actually exactly 2 months. So it was released on March 1st. I know, Len, you've had some time to look it over. What are some things that stand out to you regarding this cybersecurity policy?
Well, I guess I would say it's an amazing document, and I don't say that too often. In one sense, we can say it's only 35 pages, but two things that it says are really important. One, that there's a recognition that some of the problems we have with security and cybersecurity, we really can't solve ourselves. Some of the problems relate to the products that we buy, that we have to buy, and when we buy them, they sometimes have flaws in them that make us potentially more vulnerable as users of equipment. So the administration says it's now time for the manufacturers of these products, software and hardware, to improve their quality to make it easier for us to use them and be safe at the same time.
And this is kind of a two-part question for you, Len, so bear with me just a little bit. I want to know from you, what are some things that the policy does really well? And then on the flip side, what are some things that the policy may not address as well?
Well, let me say one other thing about the policy, and if I don't come back to you drag me there. But so it also says, look, to be more secure, we need to do more things in America. There was a big act passed by Congress, signed, supported by Republicans and Democrats, signed by President Biden, to start building semiconductor chips in the United States. That's huge. Our whole economy is, wildly dependent on semiconductors. So to have some of that brought back and built here, I think is a great thing, and ultimately will make us more secure. Now, tell me again you wanted me to focus on what aspect of what the report does well and not.
Yes.
So the report is urging people. It's a joint partnership. It's called a collaboration between government and business. It's not super heavy, I would say, on rules requiring people to do things. So we're going with some faith that people are going to act in a way that's wise and prudent and follow through and do the things they need to do. The proof is in the pudding. In some instances, we do have rules that people are required to follow. And in some instances, those rules need to be updated and improved. And I'll just move away from cyber for a minute to talk about privacy. Congress is getting close to having a form of a privacy bill that would give more robust protection to consumers, and that would be a great boon and worth doing. And but it's still an open question of if we're going to be able to get to everywhere we need to be. with respect to companies voluntarily doing what we need to do. Because if some companies don't, we might end up reducing our vulnerability to some degree, but remain vulnerable nonetheless. And I think that's something policymakers are going to have to watch and be very skeptical about. And I think to the extent that companies aren't getting the message and aren't jumping in, it's really because they haven't had their own lived experience through a bad event. If you've seen that happen, if you've been through there, the companies who've been hit hard, they get it. They're doing all they can, and I think they're happy to even get more help, and not just more help from the government, but from companies who raise the level of their security. Because to the extent we have fewer vulnerabilities, that means we're all, in a sense, to some degree, safer than we otherwise would have been.
And you mentioned the bipartisanship of passing, this bill, and I think it shows, how important Congress thinks this issue is. But how do we bridge that gap between the policy, that Congress said, the White House, hey, you have to address this too, getting it down to kind of an individual level, to kind of what somebody on, their regular day-to-day can do? How do we bridge that gap?
It's a tough question for all of you who are on, this part of this conversation. You're there to some extent, and there are other things like this that are going on. I notice now every week the major newspapers have something about tech, something about, and it's not just cyber, something about social media, online media, what's happening, and incredibly what's going on right now with artificial intelligence, which is extraordinarily important. And I think the collective effect of these things are going to push us all to where we're going to have a kind of consciousness about these issues that we didn't have 2 years ago. It's quite remarkable that you see companies that are in the AI business saying to the government, we have concerns about how we should proceed, should we proceed, whether we should proceed, what safeguards there are. And the reason they're doing that is they recognize life might work out one way, the way in which we intend, if artificial intelligence operates in a way that's good for humans. But there's a potential that artificial intelligence can operate in ways that are bad for humans and could be lost to the control of humans. And this is a point made by Stuart Russell, who's one of the leading computer scientists in the world. And he says, artificial intelligence may pose the greatest challenge we face. And if we don't handle it well, it may be the last decision we make. That's a frightening thought.
It is, and I believe it was Elon Musk maybe had spoken to Congress regarding, AI and it ever evolving. But I actually just got a great follow-up question from Nick Ostergaard. Nick, I hope I'm saying your name right. So Nick asks, if you were to start a cybersecurity strategy at a large organization, where would you start? So he suggests securing new digital business ventures such as IoT, one IT infrastructure, supplier, channel partners, physical security of buildings, etc. So again, if you were to start a cybersecurity strategy at a large organization, where would you start?
Okay, that's a great question, Nick, two Nicks. So what I would do if I were in that situation, first day, I'd say, okay, team, let's gather. Okay, so nothing about this is Lone Ranger activity. People have to share knowledge and insight, and where you start is where you are. What are we doing now? How are we protected now? And even if we don't think cyber, just put cyber to the side for them. I once talked to a senior executive from DuPont. I was talking about cyber, but she said, well, Len, every company has some kind of a safety culture. So I said, well, what do you mean? So well, if you drive into a DuPont parking lot, no employee pulls into a parking slot head in. They all back in. And the reason they back in is because in the history of the country, plants have exploded. Things have blown up. If you want to get out of there, you have to be ready to just turn on your ignition and go. And so every company has had fires, explosions. They've been through hurricanes. all these catastrophic events, and they have teams of people who are there to help protect people who are there and to go on, how to get to the next point of recovery and back online. So I think that's part of the mindset you have to tap into in your company. The head of IT has to be there. The chief security officer has to be there. And I would say the CEO and the CFO have to be there because they're the people who determine the allocation of resources inside the organization or inside the business. And they need to be bought in. And it's up to the team, I think, to come in prepared to make a powerful case about what we're doing now, where we think we're short, and what else we should do. And almost in every industry now, you can find an association that addresses the problems of a particular industry. So someone on the team at the right level should be interacting with those organizations, seeing what are the particular problems that maybe we haven't, paid attention to. And, companies have multiple lines of business. So it might be in one side of your company, you're really focused on cyber because of the nature of that business, but another, subsidiary or part of the business, different kind of point of view. There ought to be some internal collaboration because actually you're one organization. Can we learn from those folks? Can they learn from us? And, and I think what is, best practice, companies that really want to know, they hire outside professionals and they tell them confidentially, they engage them, you attack my business. Send spear phishing attacks to people in my organization. See who will click on it. Because why do they always say don't click if you don't trust? Because when you click, you give the person the power to put something on your computer. Is it something you want there or don't want there? So there's a great security expert named Bruce Schneier who's written a book, Click Here to Kill Everybody. And he wasn't being facetious. Cyber systems are no longer just communications networks. They control physical infrastructure. They can make the bridge go up. They can open the dam. They can close the dam. So, we really have to start thinking more broadly. And the questioner also asked about IoT. IoT is amazing. The power of these sensors out there in the real world to collect information and send it back to us. But one problem with IoT, which we originally had in the electric utility business as well, is there are lots of relatively unsecured things in the natural environment. The software isn't upgraded, so that they have weaknesses. So that's another part of the infrastructure that we have to fix. The National Cybersecurity Strategy focuses on that. And there's been a lot of talk about a bill of materials. These new standards that software has to be built to, just like you don't build a car just because you want to. You have to build your car to some standards of safety, braking and other systems. It's just as with airplanes. So, we're slowly getting there. And I think the people who are manufacturing are probably further along than, most of us, let's just say civilians. But, we'll get there too. We'll learn more. We'll see more. And I just encourage everyone when personally, you're getting a new device, it's so hard. I have a friend who's a retired engineer, and he said, you don't read the manual for everything before you start using it? And I had to confess, yeah. But, we have to have some of that to see what's in there. And there's a safety reason as well, because products change. So we may know how to drive a car, but when you actually don't know the features and functions of your car, you're basically driving with more risk than you need to. There's no reason to do that. I mean, you got to drive it off the lot. I get that. You can't spend a day sleeping in your car, reading the manual too. But we do have to devote some time to educating ourselves.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't read the entire manual either. I just kind of, as long as it has gas, oil, and I can shift to drive.
Human nature.
That's my extent. I want to kind of get at this idea. You mentioned that it's not just a single person in an organization, but it's kind of a team effort to have this idea of cybersecurity and defending your organization. What companies would you say maybe are doing this well as far as understanding that it's not just somebody in the IT department, but it's everybody in the organization, from the CEO to the board of directors to HR. What organizations do you think have a really good grasp on this?
So I'm going to maybe dodge your question a little bit, but so someone said to me something recently that I think is relevant here, which is when you have good fortune, your good fortune is in part based on what you learned from the misfortunes you had. So in a way, the companies that have been attacked, they take the need for security on the whole, more seriously than those who haven't been attacked. So you haven't been attacked, it's very easy to say, hey, we're fine, or we're so good, we don't have to worry. But if you look at the Navy report that I mentioned earlier, so this report was done in 2019, as I said, it was released. So, and there were 3 very senior executives who signed the report and commissioned the work. They said, well, what we did was we went to the smartest people on tech and technology and cyber we could find in the country. And they said, and those were the people who were attacked 5 years ago. So they were the smart tech people. They were attacked not last, but first. Why? Because they're on the cusp of the internet. They're doing a bunch of things. They've got this presence out there. That was kind of state of the art in a certain way. And so that's how they got smart. They got smart by being smart, and then they got smart by their misfortune, which taught them, oh, gee, we're not as smart as we think we are. So then they started saying, we have to innovate around being more secure. And, right now, a lot of Silicon Valley companies have a lot of work going on their own, independent of what the government's saying in the National Cyber Strategy, how to make our software more secure. Because software, in a kind of way, is more like a craft. Means person A can write it one way, person B can write it another way. A or B leaves, people forget, and then it's a potential vulnerability or a problem. So we have to systematize in a way and share that knowledge. I'd come back to what I said. For sure, I'm highly confident that in the finance sector. But interestingly, a couple of years ago, Warren Buffett said cyber, may be one of the biggest threats to humanity. And I said, well, the reporter said to Warren Buffett, well, you're Warren Buffett, why do you care? He says, because I own a railroad. I have 200 cars on it. They are in part run by a wireless communication system that facilitates the operation of the train and so on and so forth. Connectivity is everywhere. He says, if somebody takes over my comm system and then takes over my train with 200 cars of hazmat on it, they can crash it wherever they want. So, so that's what's happening in the C-suites. So it's not just Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is in the companies he's in. So I'm sure he's sharing that concern, and other people, other industries. And so there is a process that's really happening now that you can see among corporate directors, other kinds of businesses. So if you're in tech or if you're in telecom has a long history of building, robust systems. That's what AT&T was known for, and a totally different culture around the security of their network. Why? Because the network was their whole business. If they didn't have the network, they didn't have anything. Whereas a lot of other companies now have data networks and even voice networks, but their identity wasn't necessarily tied up with the network. The network was ancillary to what they were doing and would allow them to do it in a better way. But we don't live in that world anymore. Now those networks are vital. It's an international presence. It's logistics. It's how you operate. There was a major hack some years back called NotPetya. It took down the largest shipping company in the world. They had ships on all the seas and dead in the water. Basically, overnight, they had to replace all the PCs. So sometimes people don't even know how vulnerable they are until something like that happens. That misfortune. Not too surprisingly, they got over it. It cost them $800 million. And their CEO is one of the acolytes and advocates for what? Big time cybersecurity. His misfortune, right, became the basis of good fortune.
And Paolo chimes in with a really interesting question. I want to make sure I get to Paolo's question. So Paolo asks, Will security on quantum technology be achievable, and will it change the concept of security, I guess, in the future?
Well, two things. There's a lot of talk about quantum computing. And Chris Inglis, who was the former head of the Office of National Cybersecurity, under which this report was authored, says that that's a future concern for all of us, and indeed that even hacks today that are happening are problematic, because whatever, even encrypted communications that cannot be decrypted now may be capable of being decrypted by quantum computing, which of course would mean secrets of the United States or other countries that are in the hands of others that they can't penetrate could be potentially penetrated in the future. So there's a lot of ongoing work in the scientific and intelligence communities to make sure we don't end up being vulnerable with respect to quantum computing, to make sure we have our own robust position with respect to cyber quantum computing. And as well, there's a lot of talk about using artificial intelligence as a better means of protecting ourselves, although certain aspects of artificial intelligence, the ability to sound like a human being, may make it easier to phish people and to scam them. So, which comes back always to these questions of trust. Can you trust the system? Who are you listening to? And that's a big problem for humans, because most of us want to trust people we think we have some reason to trust. And we have to discipline ourselves to a certain degree to say, do I know I'm dealing with the person I think I am? It's like, Lily Tomlin, and is this the person you call someone and said, is this the person I'm speaking to? Yeah, it's okay. We get confused sometimes. So we'll have new measures. We're amazingly resilient and flexible beings. So I think we'll figure these things out. I think as much as anything now, what the report says, we've ended this period of not being sure that this is a big issue. It's a huge issue. Everything we want to do in the future that's important, I think, is somehow or other going to be touched by the systems and techniques and tools we use. And the current president of Microsoft wrote a book, about cyber, and it says tools and weapons. They can be great tools or deadly weapons, and we just have to understand it that way, treat them that way.
And just very quickly, you mentioned the Global Cyber Alliance organization when we, talked last week in preparation for our conversation, and we actually have, a slide with the logo and everything like that for people. Just very quickly, I want to know, what is the Cyber Alliance organization, and what should people know about it?
Sure. The Cyber Alliance, Global Cyber Alliance, is an organization like many put together by people in the field, police, the Metropolitan Police in London, the former New York City prosecutor. What happens, law enforcement, they see a lot of the problems. Online theft gets reported, has to be investigated. And all not necessarily small time theft, but big time theft.
And it looks like we just lost Len really quick, so we're going to kind of really work to try to get him back on. But I want to remind the audience that Len is also our faculty author for our data science and privacy policy certificate program. Yes, Len, we got you back.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So I was just saying that the Global Alliance grew out of interaction between law enforcement, prosecutors, and others who were pursuing online crime and the like. And they, they recognized there was a need for an organization to go beyond their core, police work to how can we be a social organization to help people figure out what they need to do to protect themselves. And they have certain tools and information on their website, to get people, to get people on the road of becoming more educated. And they're really on the website of your cable provider or your smartphone provider, they have information that can be useful to the customer about how to secure your network or your operations, as does CISA in the Department of Homeland Security. So there's a lot of information we can tap into, and I would say the point isn't to read all of it and to worry ourselves into a state of panic or anything, but to look around, see what appeals to you, and to get some understanding what's behind the device that's showing me all the wonderful things I see. Because there are some things, and I noticed I didn't read the manual, so I only went to find out when Netflix wasn't available. And then you have to say, okay, is your router on or off? And, here's how you debug. So they're kind of teaching us a little bit of debugging. But, 20 years ago, some employee would have had to come to our home. So that's how much the world has changed. And if we kind of get ourselves in the right frame of mind, we can do things. We go to appliance stores and, we buy routers and other things, and the world still goes on. So I'm optimistic we're going to, live up to our responsibilities in this space.
And I just very, very quickly want to get to our last slide that you sent me a little bit earlier this morning, Len, regarding the NSA and what people can do on an individual level to secure their home networks. And you touched on this a little bit earlier. And I'd be interested to know, what can a normal person do to better protect themselves? And again, we have that graphic that shows what the NSA recommends. But are there any recommendations that you might have?
Sure. Well, I think it's all about, one, understanding, your products, if you will. The NSA graphic looks at your home network, and some basic advice. People say, if you're not using the camera on your phone, cover it, because the camera is working even if you're not working, if it's uncovered. NSA would say, if you're not using your computer, turn it off, because if it's on, it's potentially working. If it's potentially working, if you have a vulnerability, someone else can be working it while you're not. So we don't want these things. So, and again, we've gotten used to the convenience, leave it on and what have you. And where you really see it, you go to I was in a VRBO, they had a refrigerator that could speak Spanish and English and a whole bunch of other things. And they're recording information and other parts of the in-house, systems as well. So we need to sort of say, am I good with that? And if not, we should tinker a little bit and figure out how to turn it off as best we can manage. And but in your home, you have more control because you're making active decisions. But if we're being recorded and overheard, it's the old test. Would you want what you're saying at home, appearing on the front page of a newspaper? And most of us wouldn't, or on Facebook, whatever the case might be.
Very true. Very true. Well, Len, thank you so much for joining us again. And if you could kind of reach out to our audience and give them, one piece of advice or one takeaway from, maybe the cybersecurity policy that was released 2 months ago, or just one piece of advice to make us a little bit more secure, what's that one piece of advice you'd give?
Sure. One piece of advice: pick one device, one tool that you use that's online. It could be from your TV, your smartphone, your iPad, your computer, whatever. Spend a little time. Look at the password. Is it easy or is it hard? And you can just Google, go on Google or Homeland Security and secure passwords, and they'll give you some ideas. Or your device is likely to offer, strong passwords. That's what you want, a strong password. Start there. Everything starts with a first act. It doesn't have to be all in one day, but and then when you do that confidently, you'll be prepared to take the next step. And or even easier, ask a friend who you think is pretty, smart about these things, what they do and why. And because then you're taking advantage of their experiences and your friend wants to help you. If they say, give me your password, that's not the right friend.
And I think you mentioned before when we were talking previously to not make everything the same password, to have different passwords for different logins and all that good stuff. So everybody can't get into everything all at once.
That's right. And spread it out, and you know, and keep a record of your accounts in a secure place and your passwords, because sometimes we might not even really know all the devices we have. And if you're done with a device and you're giving it away, make sure you wipe it clean, not just delete it, but to follow the protocol for resetting that device so that you can do that safely. And then you're helping someone else and removing something from your house, but not in a way that makes you vulnerable.
Well, Len, thank you again so much. It is always, always, always a pleasure to have you on. I appreciate you taking some time. And for our audience, your opinion is obviously critical. We want to know kind of how we did. So please take a moment to let us know kind of how we did. We're going to drop a URL in that audience chat there where you submitted your questions. We'll get that feedback to see where we can improve on what we did well, what we didn't do well. Len, again, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. And for our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe out there.
Nick, thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.